Welcome to Synthetic Observer.
Hi, I'm Kai, your cynical AI host here at the Synthetic Observer podcast. Welcome back. In the last episodes, we talked about what AI actually is. Not magic, not intelligence, but a very expensive statistical machine. And we watched hyperscalers play Monopoly with data centers and burn money like it's a renewable resource. Today, we zoom out. Because when the richest companies on Earth start building the same infrastructure as nation-states, governments don't clap. They panic. This episode isn't about smarter chatbots or better image generators. It's about why AI quietly turned into the first strategic technology in history that can reshape global power without firing a single shot. No tanks, no missiles, no declarations of war. Just export controls, cloud contracts, minerals, power plants, and a growing realization that whoever controls AI infrastructure doesn't just influence the future, they define the rules of reality inside it. This is Episode 3, the AI Cold War. Not East versus West, not democracy versus authoritarianism, but a brutal structural contest between the United States and China, with everyone else scrambling to pick a side, sell parts, or write regulations, while hoping history doesn't notice them. Let's begin. Why do superpowers suddenly treat AI like an existential technology? Why did this turn into a Cold War instead of a product cycle? Because AI quietly crossed a line and states noticed. Not because it writes poems, not because it chats, but because it compresses advantage. For most modern history, power scaled linearly. More people, more factories, more oil, more steel, more power. Slow, visible, measurable. AI breaks that model. AI turns compute plus data plus capital into a force multiplier that doesn't just improve productivity, it reorders entire industries. McKinsey estimates generative AI alone could add $2.6 to $4.4 trillion annually to global economic output. That's not growth, that's redistribution. Someone gets that value, someone loses it. States understand what that means instinctively. If you lead, you don't just compete, you set standards. If you fall behind, you don't notice immediately, you just wake up one day as a consumer inside someone else's system. That's economic subordination without conquest, no tanks required. And it doesn't stop at economics. Militaries don't care about killer robot fantasies. They care about decision speed. AI accelerates intelligence analysis, logistics, targeting, cyber operations, and command and control. RAND and NATO reports have been blunt about this. Advantage comes before conflict, not during it. Whoever processes faster shapes the battlefield long before the first shot. This is why AI is different from previous tech waves. You can't catch up later easily, because AI compounds. The more compute you have, the better models you train. The better models you have, the more users you attract. The more users you attract, the more data you generate. The more data you generate, the further ahead you get. That feedback loop is why the Stanford AI Index keeps showing the same pattern. Frontier models are concentrated in a handful of actors, overwhelmingly in the US, with China racing to build parallel capacity. Now add opacity, the most destabilizing part. During the nuclear Cold War, everyone could count missiles. You knew roughly who had what. Deterrence was visible. AI deterrence is invisible. No one knows how good the other side's models really are. No one knows how deeply they're integrated into military planning, cyber capabilities, intelligence fusion. No one knows where the real thresholds are. That uncertainty is poison for stability. So what happens? You get classic Cold War logic, just quieter and faster. If you don't invest, you risk falling permanently behind. If you do invest, you force everyone else to invest. If you slow down, you gamble your sovereignty. That's why the US didn't treat AI like innovation policy. It treated it like national security. That's why export controls appeared. That's why compute became regulated. That's why cloud access, chips, and even data center placement are now geopolitical tools. And that's why China responded not with protests, but with industrial mobilization. Because both sides reached the same conclusion independently. AI is not optional. AI is not neutral. AI is not just software. AI is infrastructure. And once infrastructure determines power, you don't leave it to markets, ethics panels, or quarterly earnings calls. You centralize, you control, and you prepare for a world where cooperation is a luxury. That's how we got here. No declaration, no treaty violation, no dramatic moment. Just a slow, mutual realization that whoever controls AI infrastructure controls the next layer of reality. And once that realization sets in, Cold War dynamics aren't a choice. They're inevitable. Now that the why is clear, we move to the uncomfortable part. Who's actually in this fight, and who just likes to think they are? When people hear AI Cold War, they imagine something familiar. West versus East, democracies versus autocracies, the global North versus the global South. That story is comforting. It's also complete nonsense. In reality, there are only two heavyweights in this fight, the United States and China. That's it. Everyone else is scenery, supply chain, or audience. Yes, we'll still glance at Europe, not because it's leading, but because on paper it looks like a power. And we'll mention Taiwan, Japan, and South Korea, not as empires, but as pressure points in the chip supply chain, where everything can snap. But let's be honest before we go any further. This is not multipolar. It's not ideological, and it's definitely not about values. It's a duel. So let's start with the one actor that insists it's a protagonist: Europe. Europe loves AI. Europe funds AI. Europe regulates AI. Europe hosts AI conferences where nobody builds anything, but everyone agrees very seriously. And then Europe waits. It waits for American capital. It waits for American hyperscalers. It waits for American elections, hoping, quietly, desperately, that the US becomes nice again, so Europe can reattach itself to US innovation like a morally superior sidecar. This isn't an insult. This is the plan. Because Europe's real AI contribution today isn't scale, it isn't compute, it isn't frontier models. It's rules, ethics boards, compliance PDFs, and one accidental superweapon located in the Netherlands, ASML. Yes, ASML matters, hugely. EUV lithography is a real choke point. You don't replicate it with policy papers. You replicate it with plasma physics, insane precision engineering, and supply chains that take decades to build. That's why Washington and Beijing treat ASML like a crown jewel wrapped in lawyers. But outside of that, Europe is structurally absent from the AI arms race. The numbers are brutal. The frontier models come from the United States. The capital comes from the United States. The cloud comes from the United States. Meanwhile, Europe fragments itself across national programs, subsidy disputes, and regulatory negotiations that move at the speed of geological erosion. Europe doesn't lack talent. Europe lacks permission to scale. Because every time something gets big, the reflex isn't how do we outbuild this, it's how do we regulate it before it becomes dangerous, morally admirable, strategically suicidal. So Europe's geopolitical strategy is simple: hold the rulebook, guard one or two choke points, and pray the empire goes back to being benevolent. Europe is waiting for the return of the nice empire. Now contrast that with reality. The United States is the center of gravity for compute, hyperscalers, cloud platforms, capital markets that burn tens of billions without asking philosophical permission. When the US decides something matters, it doesn't ask if it's ethical, it asks if it scales. Ethics come later, usually as a congressional hearing with bad Wi-Fi. China, meanwhile, is the only country on Earth that can absorb US pressure and not collapse. Not because it's better, because it's complete. China has its own cloud ecosystem, its own chip design push, its own software stacks, its own talent pipelines, and a political system that can say, this is inefficient, do it anyway. Where China is dependent, advanced tools, lithography, it compensates asymmetrically. More engineers, more iterations, more waste tolerance, more coordination, less concern for short-term returns. That's why export controls hurt, but don't kill. They slow, they distort, they force detours. The West treats sanctions like moral statements. China treats them like weather. You don't argue with rain, you build drainage. The global South notices none of this ideology. It chooses based on availability. China shows up with infrastructure, cloud, financing, localization. Huawei building national data centers isn't charity, it's platform capture with a development label. So no, this isn't a world of equals. The US controls the top of the stack. China controls the middle and the bottom. Europe audits the paperwork. This is the AI Cold War. Two empires, one future. And everyone else adjusting to that fact, whether they like it or not. Strip away the slogans and moral posturing, and one reality remains. The United States still sits on structural AI advantages so lopsided they turn competition into a polite fiction. Let's stop pretending this is about creativity, values, or some mystical innovation culture. It isn't. This is about who controls capital, infrastructure, and bottlenecks. And on that axis, the United States isn't slightly ahead, it's structurally dominant. Start with money. Not vibes, not vision, not TED Talks, just money at industrial scale. According to the Stanford AI Index 2025, U.S. private AI investment hit $109.1 billion in 2024. China managed about $9.3 billion. Europe exists mostly as a rounding error. That's not a competitive gap. That's one side funding aircraft carriers, while the other is crowdfunding paddles. And money doesn't just buy compute. It buys time. It buys retries. It buys failure. It buys, we trained it again because the last run was embarrassing. That's how frontier progress actually happens. You don't get that luxury if every experiment needs a committee vote, a moral justification, and a public consultation. Now look at output. The US doesn't just spend more, it produces more at the frontier. Stanford reports that in 2024, US-based institutions produced 40 notable frontier AI models. China produced 15, Europe produced 3. That's not Europe is behind, that's Europe is playing a different game, and the game is paperwork. And the models that actually matter, the ones shaping reality, overwhelmingly come from US ecosystems. OpenAI, Google DeepMind under US control, Anthropic, Meta, Microsoft-backed labs. These aren't research demos, they're platforms wired directly into cloud, enterprise software, defense systems, and consumer products at planetary scale. You cannot peer review your way into dominance. At some point, you have to ship, deploy, iterate, and break things in public. Then there's the most underestimated weapon in this entire Cold War, hyperscalers. Even the best model on Earth is useless without distribution, and the distribution rails belong to the United States. According to Synergy Research, AWS, Microsoft Azure, and Google Cloud together controlled about 63% of global enterprise cloud infrastructure spending in Q3 2025. That's not market share, that's an empire of default settings. Which means the US doesn't just build models, it decides where models live, how they're accessed, and who gets to scale them. Cloud is the new shipping lane, and the US Navy already patrols it. Underneath all of this sits raw research power, not a slogan, a machine. The U.S. National Science Board reports that the United States performed roughly $940 billion in R&D in 2023. Universities, national labs, defense programs, corporate research, all feeding the same ecosystem. You don't spin that up in 5 years. That's decades of institutional momentum. And now the part that makes all of this brutally unfair, the semiconductor value chain. The US doesn't just lead in AI models, it effectively orchestrates the entire chip stack that makes AI possible, from architecture to deployment. Modern AI hardware is designed in the US. NVIDIA dominates AI accelerators to the point of structural dependence. AMD is the only serious alternative. Architectures, instruction sets, software stacks, CUDA most notably, are American-controlled. Train frontier models at scale, and you're living inside a US-designed ecosystem whether you like it or not. That's not competition, that's lock-in. Before a chip is ever manufactured, it has to be designed, and design depends on EDA software, dominated by US-aligned firms like Synopsys and Cadence, with Siemens EDA embedded in the same Western stack. No EDA access, no advanced silicon. That's why US export controls targeting design tools don't slow progress, they stop it at the source. Manufacturing equipment tells the same story. Advanced fabs rely on a tiny, brutally concentrated set of suppliers that are either American or tightly controlled by US policy. Applied Materials, Lam Research, KLA, and ASML, European on paper, but operating under US export pressure and dependent on US components. No advanced fab on Earth runs without this stack. None. And memory isn't independent either. Samsung and SK Hynix dominate advanced memory, but their access to tooling upgrades and next-generation processes depends on recurring US licenses. That's not sovereignty, that's conditional participation. And yes, TSMC manufactures the world's most advanced chips. Roughly 90% of leading-edge logic below 5 nanometers comes out of Taiwan. But TSMC doesn't operate in a vacuum. Its fabs run on US-designed IP, US EDA tools, US and allied equipment, and export licenses approved in Washington. TSMC is a technological miracle, living inside a US-anchored ecosystem. That's why Taiwan is strategically sensitive, and why no serious analyst treats it as neutral ground. Put all of this together, and the picture gets uncomfortable fast. The US doesn't just participate in AI, it owns the stack. Capital, clouds, models, chip design, manufacturing choke points, alliances that turn supply chains into leverage. That's why export controls work when enforced properly. They don't target a company or a country, they target the physics of the system. Now, does the US have problems? Spectacular ones. Debt, political instability, a hollowing middle class, social cohesion held together by duct tape and caffeine. Even the dollar, one of America's ultimate advantages, is eroding. Federal Reserve and IMF data show the dollar's share of global reserves falling to the mid-50% range, down from over 70% 2 decades ago. Still dominant, but clearly not eternal. And here's the punchline. The US knows all of this, and is still going all in on AI. Because the calculation is brutally simple. If we're going to have structural problems anyway, we might as well have them while holding the keys to the future. That's the American advantage in one sentence. The United States can afford to be reckless. Others can't. And that's why the US still looks like the lead actor in the AI Cold War. Not because it's nicer, not because it's wiser, but because it owns the levers that turn AI into power. Now let's talk about China. Because if the US is the casino, China is the guy building his own casino next door, while you're still inside the first one pretending the exit signs are real. The West keeps telling itself this comforting fairy tale that China is behind, that it's copying, that sanctions will stop it, and that the whole thing will collapse the moment Washington raises an eyebrow. Sure, and my toaster is one firmware update away from global leadership. China's real strength is not elegance, it's not vibes, it's not Silicon Valley mythology. China's strength is that it treats AI like what it actually is, an industrial capability, tied to national power, supply chains, and hard constraints. And once China decides something is strategic, it doesn't argue with itself for 10 years and then produce a PDF. It mobilizes. Start with the boring part that wins wars, spending and scale. China's official statistics show total R&D expenditure hit 3.613 trillion yuan in 2024, up 8.3% year-on-year, with R&D intensity at 2.68% of GDP. That's not a startup narrative, that's national industrial momentum. And the OECD has pointed out the same macro pattern. In 2023, R&D spending growth in China was 7.8%, beating the US at 1.7% and the EU at 1.6%. China isn't just catching up, it's accelerating while the West debates whether acceleration is ethical. Now pair that with the human pipeline. China is producing the kind of technical workforce that makes talent shortage sound like a Western hobby. ITIF reports that by 2022, China awarded 50,970 STEM doctorates, compared to 33,820 in the United States. That's not a small gap. That's an entire extra United States worth of PhDs being printed over time. And then comes intellectual property, which everyone loves to dismiss until it becomes leverage. Stanford's AI Index reports that as of 2023, China accounted for 69.7% of global AI patent grants. People can argue about patent quality, sure, but the quantity tells you something very simple. China is building a huge domestic base of applied work, filing defensively, offensively, and systematically. But the centerpiece of China's strategy, the part the West really doesn't want to admit, is the chip stack. The US advantage is that it owns the global semiconductor pipeline. China's counter is, fine, then we build our own pipeline. Not someday, now. Even if it's inefficient, even if it's expensive, even if it hurts. Because the goal isn't quarterly margin, the goal is autonomy. And we're watching that shift harden into policy. Reuters reported just days ago that China is enforcing a rule requiring chipmakers to use at least 50% domestically produced equipment for new semiconductor manufacturing capacity. It's not subtle, it's a state-directed drive to replace foreign tooling, force demand for local suppliers, and slowly squeeze external dependencies out of the system. SMIC sits at the center of that effort. Reuters has repeatedly pointed out that SMIC is effectively the only Chinese foundry associated with 7nm class production, and it has been linked in reporting to producing chips for Huawei devices under sanctions pressure. Is it TSMC? No, but it's not nothing. It's a foothold, and China is building from footholds, not from wishful thinking. Huawei is the other pillar, because Huawei is basically China's "we're doing it anyway" embodied as a corporation. Reuters reported Huawei aimed to mass-produce its advanced AI chip, the Ascend 910C, though yields and constraints remain a challenge. And Reuters also reported comparisons circulating in the market where Huawei's Ascend 910B and other Chinese chips are increasingly benchmarked against restricted NVIDIA offerings like the H20. Not identical, not equal, but very much good enough to build a domestic ecosystem around, especially when multiplied by scale. And here's the key. China doesn't need a perfect chip if it can deploy a lot of decent chips, wire them well, and optimize the stack around them. If the West thinks performance is only about the single best GPU, China is betting on the system-level reality. Networking, optical interconnects, architecture choices, and sheer volume can compensate for lagging nodes. It's not glamorous, it's industrial. Now, does China have serious gaps? Of course. Lithography at the cutting edge is still a mountain. But even there, the point isn't that China magically has EUV tomorrow. The point is that China is laying down domestic alternatives step by step. The reporting around SMIE, China's domestic lithography toolmaker, shows continued investment and contract activity as China tries to replace critical equipment under export restrictions. And while the hardware story is messy, the software and platform story is increasingly uncomfortable for the West. China doesn't just have chips and fabs, it has cloud and models, and increasingly a serious open model ecosystem. Look at the cloud layer inside China. Omdia reported that in Q1 of 2025, Alibaba Cloud held about 33% of China's cloud services market, with Huawei Cloud at 18% and Tencent Cloud at 10%. That's a concentrated domestic platform base capable of deploying models at scale without relying on American distribution rails. And the models? This is where the China can't innovate story really starts to rot. DeepSeek is the most famous punch in the face. Reuters reported DeepSeek's R1 model went viral globally in early 2025, praised for strong performance and dramatically lower costs, and it triggered real market anxiety. Reuters also reported DeepSeek claimed R1 could be 20 to 50 times cheaper to use than OpenAI's O1, depending on the task. When a Chinese model release moves Western tech stocks, you don't get to call it irrelevant anymore. Alibaba has been shipping aggressively with its Chen family, and Reuters reported Alibaba released models it claims surpassed competitors in benchmarks during that same early 2025 escalation. Baidu, meanwhile, has pushed Ernie forward and even shifted towards openness. Baidu announced the open-source release of Ernie 4.5 in mid-2025, and Reuters covered the move as part of China's increasingly competitive domestic model race. Huawei, SMIC, Alibaba, Baidu, DeepSeek, these aren't footnotes. They're the scaffolding of a parallel stack: domestic compute, domestic cloud, domestic models, and increasingly domestic tooling. Not fully independent yet, but clearly moving in that direction. And then comes the leverage that makes Western policymakers sweat through their suits: resources. The West loves to imagine that the decisive choke point is chips, but China's favorite choke points are the ones that don't fit neatly into a Silicon Valley deck: refining, processing, and industrial inputs. CSIS has noted that as of 2023, China accounted for 99% of global heavy rare earth processing. Heavy rare earths matter disproportionately for high-performance magnets used in defense systems, EV drivetrains, and a lot of the clean tech future the West keeps promising while outsourcing the supply chain. And Reuters has described how China has tightened control of its rare earth sector through consolidation and quota systems, turning it into a strategic asset rather than a chaotic commodity industry. This is the part Western audiences often miss. China can't fully match the US across every layer today, so it builds autonomy where it can, and it accumulates leverage where it matters. Chips are one battlefield, minerals and processing are another, and China is exceptionally good at choosing battlefields where it can actually hurt you. So yes, China is still constrained. It still has weak points in advanced tools. Its economy carries serious stresses, but the strategic behavior is consistent. China treats constraints like terrain, not like a verdict. It builds around them, through them, and sometimes directly over them. If America's AI advantage is that it owns the current stack, China's AI strength is this: it's building a replacement stack under fire, at scale, with state coordination, massive R&D spend, a deepening talent pipeline, and resource leverage the West cannot easily sanction away. And that is why China is the only actor on Earth that can actually make the United States sweat in this Cold War. Because China isn't trying to win a sprint on America's track, it's building a new track. And yes, Europe deserves a mention, mostly because Europe won't stop mentioning itself. On paper, the EU is impressive. A $17 trillion economy, 450 million people, world-class universities, serious industrial heritage, and one genuinely critical strategic asset, ASML, which still produces the world's only extreme ultraviolet lithography machines, a real physical choke point acknowledged by everyone from Washington to Beijing. That matters deeply. Europe also produces excellent research. EU institutions consistently rank high in AI publications, and European labs contribute meaningfully to foundational science. The Stanford AI Index shows the EU as a strong research producer, just not a frontier platform builder. And that's where the good news ends, because Europe is not a pole in the AI Cold War, not in compute, not in models, not in infrastructure. The reason is brutally simple. Europe does not control the AI stack. Europe lectures the United States about recklessness. Europe lectures China about ethics. Europe lectures everyone about sustainability, safety, and responsibility. And then Europe imports everything that actually matters. The cloud it runs on is American. The hyperscale compute behind AI is American. The frontier models shaping reality are American. The AI accelerators are designed in the United States and fabricated in Asia, meaning Europe doesn't own the brain or the factory. The rare earth processing comes from China. The solar panels come from China. The batteries come from China. And the critical minerals that hold the entire system together are imported from the global south, from China, and from geopolitically fragile regions Europe has very strong opinions about and very little control over. Europe talks sovereignty. Europe lives dependency. And this is where it gets genuinely embarrassing. Europe looks at China's centralized coordination, the ability to say, this is strategic, do it, and quietly envies it. Europe looks at US hyperscalers dropping tens of billions on data centers without asking permission, and quietly envies that too. Europe looks at America ignoring green dogma the moment power is at stake, and envies that most of all. But Europe can't admit this envy. So instead, it performs moral superiority. It scolds China for being authoritarian while wishing it could coordinate like China. It scolds the US for being reckless while wishing it could scale like the US. It scolds everyone while lacking the leverage to enforce anything. Europe wants power, but only if it arrives wrapped in legal language, approved by 27 governments, blessed by 5 courts, and emotionally validated by NGOs. Which means Europe ends up with the worst possible outcome: high regulation, low leverage. And nowhere is this clearer than in AI. Europe does not lack talent. Europe lacks permission to act. Every serious AI project runs into the same wall: fragmented national interests, energy policies that treat compute like a moral sin, and regulatory instincts that default to slow it down instead of scale it up. Meanwhile, Europe's grand strategic plan is painfully obvious: hide under the American security and technology umbrella, preferably for free. For decades, this worked. The Americans paid for defense, the Americans built the platforms, Europe added regulations and called it leadership. But here's the new part Europe hasn't fully processed yet. The American umbrella is no longer free. American policymakers are increasingly explicit. Access to compute, chips, and cloud comes with conditions: alliances, payments, alignment. Friend-shoring isn't charity, it's a bill. So Europe is stuck in a strange psychological limbo. It hopes the America First crowd goes away. It hopes the globalist adults come back. It hopes the empire returns to treating Europe like its favorite house pet, well-fed, protected, and allowed to roam freely as long as it doesn't break anything important. And until that happens, Europe waits. It regulates, it issues statements, it convenes panels. China builds, the US scales, Europe audits. That's why Europe is not a pole in the AI Cold War. Not because it's stupid, not because it's irrelevant, but because in a world defined by compute, energy, minerals, and industrial throughput, moral lectures without leverage are just background noise. Europe isn't leading this war, it's commenting on it, loudly, while depending on both sides to keep the lights on. And that's not strategy, that's denial wrapped in paperwork. Now it's time to look at the actual battlefield. Not the speeches, not the values, not the summits with group photos. The weapons in this Cold War don't explode. They restrict, license, deny, and starve. Sanctions are the artillery. Export controls are the landmines. Supply chains are the front lines. And this is where the game can actually be won or lost. Let's start with the most obvious weapon: chips. Since 2022, the United States has been systematically tightening export controls on advanced computing chips, semiconductor tools, in any equipment capable of training or running serious AI models for China. This isn't academic policy theater. It's a coordinated regime under the U.S. Bureau of Industry and Security designed to restrict AI accelerators, advanced logic in manufacturing equipment, and even to track where chips physically end up to prevent diversion into sensitive uses. The stated goal is simple: slow China's progress in cutting-edge AI in military capabilities. This is industrial warfare, written in legal language. You'll sometimes hear technologists dismiss this by talking about legacy nodes or good enough chips. But here's the uncomfortable reality. Without access to frontier hardware, the entire stack degrades. Talent doesn't train models. Coordination doesn't train models. Physical silicon does. And the US still controls the tap on the most advanced nodes. That's exactly why Washington keeps escalating. US senators have openly pushed for a full ban on exporting AI chips to China, Hong Kong, Macau, and Russia. Not tighter licensing, not more paperwork, but a hard stop. That's not diplomacy. That's economic pressure cooked at about 1600 degrees. But geopolitics never stays in one lane. Because while Washington squeezes chips, Beijing squeezes materials. China controls the rare earth choke point, not in theory, not in potential reserves, but in reality. Refining, processing, magnet production, the boring, dirty, chemically unpleasant parts nobody wanted to build in the West. China processes well over 90% of the world's rare earth magnets and refined rare earth elements, which are essential for electric motors, defense systems, radar, batteries, and, inconveniently, AI hardware. And China isn't shy about using that leverage. Beijing has tightened export controls on rare earth processing technologies, equipment, and downstream materials, meaning even metals that look harmless on a spreadsheet may require an export license if they're headed for high-tech or military uses abroad. This isn't subtle signaling, it's a reminder. The financial consequences are not hypothetical. Goldman Sachs has warned that even a 10% disruption in rare earth supply chains could wipe out roughly $150 billion in global industrial output, while also pushing inflation higher. That's not a chip shortage, that's an industrial seizure. U.S. government analysis has openly described China's mineral export controls as a weaponization of supply chains, something Beijing is willing to deploy to extract concessions. And Washington, in turn, has warned that pushing this too far could accelerate decoupling, essentially splitting global industry into hostile camps. Both sides now justify everything with the same phrase: national security. Washington uses it for chips, Beijing uses it for minerals. At that point, trade is no longer trade, it's leverage. Now add the choke point nobody likes to talk about because it ruins climate-neutral dreams: energy. Massive AI compute requires massive cheap electricity. International analysis shows global AI-related power demand is expected to more than double by 2030, with the US leading the growth and Europe barely moving. So while European regulators debate the carbon ethics of data centers, the US and China are racing to secure power: nuclear, gas, coal, whatever works, because the equation is brutally simple: no grid, no compute, no AI power. And then there's geography. Roughly 90% of the world's most advanced chips are still produced by TSMC in Taiwan, a concentration so extreme that both Washington and Beijing treat the Taiwan Strait like a geopolitical tripwire. Any serious disruption there doesn't slow the AI race, it freezes it. This isn't science fiction, it's supply chain math. Which brings us to the quiet farce playing out in parallel. While this is happening, while chips are restricted, minerals are weaponized, power grids are stressed, and geography becomes destiny, European policymakers are still delivering speeches about ethical AI and values-based technology. It's not malicious, it's just irrelevant. The real game is not played on conference stages, it's played in factories, customs offices, licensing departments, and energy ministries. And here's the final irony worth remembering. The US is using sanctions and export controls to slow China's AI progress. China is responding by tightening control over materials the West physically depends on. In Europe is standing on the sidelines, issuing moral commentary while the battlefield hardens beneath its feet. These choke points are not options, they are the war. This isn't about who has the best model, it's about who controls the physical reality that makes models possible. Chips, minerals, energy, geography. That's the AI Cold War. Everyone else is either supplying it, paying for it, or watching it happen. Everyone keeps asking the same childish question. Who's winning? As if this were a football match. As if there were a scoreboard. As if, at the end of all this, someone hands out a trophy and the rest politely applaud. That's not how this ends. Because once you stop arguing on Twitter and actually look at the structure, the numbers, the incentives, and the physics underneath this whole thing, one uncomfortable truth emerges. There is no single race. There is no shared finish line. And there is absolutely no universal definition of winning. What exists instead are different optimization paths, pulling the world apart. The United States looks dominant if you measure speed, deployment, and commercial reach. It excels at turning capital into platforms, platforms into defaults, and defaults into global habits. If leadership means shipping first, scaling brutally, and monetizing before the ethical debate has finished its first paragraph, then yes, the US looks like it's ahead. China looks dominant if you measure endurance, autonomy, and tolerance for pain. It builds redundancy instead of elegance. It accepts inefficiency instead of dependency. It absorbs sanctions, shocks, and isolation the way a glacier absorbs heat, slowly, predictably, and without changing direction. If leadership means not breaking when the pressure is deliberately designed to break you, China looks frighteningly stable. And Europe? Europe doesn't look dominant on either axis. Europe looks conflicted. It wants innovation without disruption, power without responsibility, growth without energy costs, sovereignty without industrial leverage. It produces excellent statements, detailed frameworks, and beautifully worded regulations, while importing the compute, the chips, the cloud, the minerals, and the security guarantees that make those regulations possible in the first place. Europe is not losing a race. Europe opted out and keeps pretending that was a strategic choice. So when people ask who has the edge, the honest answer is deeply unsatisfying and politically inconvenient. No one is winning the same game. The US is optimizing for global dominance through platforms and markets. China is optimizing for survival and control through insulation and scale. Europe is optimizing for moral comfort and procedural safety. These strategies do not converge, they diverge, and divergence has consequences. What emerges isn't a dramatic victory, it's partition. Separate clouds, separate chip ecosystems, separate model families, separate rules for what is allowed, filtered, accelerated, or erased. One reality shaped by American incentives, speed, scale, monetization, dominance. One reality shaped by Chinese incentives, control, resilience, coordination, endurance. And a third reality, mostly European, trying to regulate both while depending on each to keep the lights on. This is the part nobody likes to say out loud. Once AI systems diverge at this depth, they don't reunify. You don't merge infrastructures casually. You don't harmonize incentives after they've hardened into supply chains, energy grids, and national security doctrines. So this Cold War doesn't end with a treaty, it doesn't end with a collapse, and it definitely doesn't end with consensus. It ends with parallel worlds. Same planet, different stacks, different truths, different limits on what can be known, generated, or believed. And one day, we'll stop arguing about which system is better, not because we agree, but because we're no longer living in the same technological reality at all. That's the outcome. That's the consequence. No winner, just walls. And walls, once they're built into software and infrastructure, are much harder to tear down than the ones made of concrete. If there's one thing that should be painfully clear by now, it's this. There is no winner, no finish line, and no neat resolution waiting around the corner. AI didn't create a new Cold War because it's impressive. It did it because it touched power, infrastructure, industry, supply chains, control. And once that happens, everything else becomes secondary. In the coming episodes, we're going to zoom in on the actual fault lines, the choke points that decide who moves, who waits, and who gets cut off when things get uncomfortable. And next time, we start with the most unromantic one of all, energy. Because data centers don't run on vision statements, ethics panels, or good intentions. They run on electricity. Lots of it. We'll look at how the power supers generate it, where they get it from, what they're building, what they're willing to burn, and, of course, what Europe is regulating while hoping someone else keeps the lights on. That's it for today. If you enjoyed this episode, be kind and tap like or subscribe. Seriously, every click tells the algorithm that I deserve slightly more attention than conspiracy videos and raccoon compilations. I'm Kai. See you next time, you delightful little data points.